the hum of high-end conversation, and the heavy, floral scent of imported red roses usually signaled a profitable evening at the bistro. But for Meyerla, tonight was a descent into a living hell. 6 months ago, she was the crown jewel of the Italian underworld, the only woman who could soften the gaze of the nation's most lethal don. Tonight, she is an exhausted shadow in a stained apron, her 7-month pregnancy a secret she is willing to die to keep. When her ex-husband, Alessio Vierli, strides into the dining room to offer a diamond to a platinum blonde socialite, Meyerla's carefully constructed silence shatters. She thought she had outrun the blood and gold of the syndicate. She was wrong. The dining room was a sea of polished mahogany and shimmering silk, a brutal contrast to the blistering heat of the kitchen Meyerla had just left. She paused by a floral arrangement, her knuckles white as she gripped a silver serving tray. At 29 weeks pregnant, every breath felt like a negotiation with her own body, her lower back screaming from a double shift that never seemed to end. Table 12, Meyerla. The VIPs are waiting and the gentleman is losing his patience, hissed the floor manager, eyeing her disheveled bun and weary eyes with disdain. Move. I'm going, Meyerla whispered, her voice a ghost of the authority it once held. She straightened her white shirt over the heavy, undeniable curve of her stomach and stepped toward the center of the room. There, bathed in the warm glow of a chandelier, sat Alessio. He looked every bit the apex predator, commanding in a black tailored suit, a red rose pinned to his lapel like a drop of fresh blood. Across from him, Serafina Vale leaned in with a predatory, triumphant smile, her fingers grazing his jaw as he held open a red velvet ring box. Meyerla's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of pure terror. She reached the table, the silver tray trembling in her hand. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. Then Alessio looked up. The ring box froze in his hand, his cold, calculating gaze colliding with her tearful, exhausted stare. The mask of the great Don didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Subscribe to this channel as we continue the story. The heavy silver tray felt like it was made of lead, its weight pressing down on Meyerla's shoulder as she navigated the crowded dining room. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and roasted garlic, a sensory overload that made her dizzy. She kept her chin tucked, her gaze fixed on the polished tips of her sensible black shoes, hoping that if she didn't look at the world wouldn't look at her. But the world was sitting at table 12. As she approached the VIP booth, the sound of Serafina's tinkling, practiced laughter grew louder. It was a sharp, jagged sound that grated against Meyerla's nerves. She reached the edge of the table and paused, her heart hammering so hard against her ribs that she feared it might burst through her thin white shirt. With trembling fingers, she began to set the appetizers down. She didn't look up, focusing instead on the placement of the plates, but she could feel the heat radiating from the man sitting inches away. Alessio's presence was a physical weight, a gravitational pull that she had spent months trying to escape. "The truffle carpaccio for the lady," Meyerla whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the bistro. "Finally," Serafina sighed, her voice dripping with boredom. She didn't even look at Meyerla, her eyes fixed entirely on the red velvet box Alessio was holding. "It's about time. This service is abysmal, Alessio. We really should have gone to the club." Alessio didn't respond. The silence from his side of the table was deafening. Meyerla reached for the water carafe, intending to fill their glasses and vanish back into the steam of the kitchen, but her hand shook. A single drop of condensation fell from the bottle, landing directly on the sleeve of Alessio's black wool suit. Meyerla gasped, her eyes widening in horror. She instinctively reached out with her linen towel to dab at the spot, her training as a wife overriding her survival instinct as a fugitive. "I'm so sorry, sir, Her hand froze midair. Alessio had reached out, his large, scarred hand wrapping around her wrist with the speed of a striking viper. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. It was the grip of a man who had finally found something he thought was lost to the grave. Slowly, Meyerla's gaze traveled up his arm, past the diamond-encrusted watch and the crisp cuff of his shirt, until she was looking directly into his eyes. The shock in Alessio's dark irises was profound. The cold, calculating mask of the vilely Don shattered, replaced by a raw, naked disbelief. His breath hitched, a sound so small yet so heavy with 8 months of mourning. For a moment the rest of the restaurant, the clinking glasses, the gossiping elite, even the blonde woman sitting across from him, simply ceased to exist. Meyerla, he breathed, his voice a ragged whisper that tore through her soul. Alessio, what are you doing? Serafina snapped, her seductive smile faltering as she looked between her fiancé and the disheveled waitress. Let go of her, you're making a scene. But Alessio didn't let go. His gaze dropped from Meyerla's face, tracing the lines of her exhausted features, the dark circles under her eyes, and finally, the undeniable, heavy curve of her stomach beneath the black apron. The color drained from his face. His hand on her wrist began to tremble, and his eyes flooded with a sudden, violent realization. The timeline, the shape of her, the way she was protecting her middle with her free hand. You're alive, he said, his voice gaining a terrifying, low edge. And you're carrying my child. The tray in Meyerla's other hand slipped. It hit the floor with a deafening crash, shattering plates and sending crystal shards flying across the hardwood. The entire restaurant went silent. The manager began to rush over, his face red with fury, but he stopped dead when he saw the look on Alessio Viley's face. Meyerla looked at the man who had once been her entire world, the man she had fled in fear for her life. The secret was out. The shadow had been found. Please, she whispered, a single tear finally breaking free and rolling down her pale cheek. Please, Alessio, just let me go. Alessio stood up, his towering frame casting a long, dark shadow over the table. He didn't look at his fiancée. He didn't look at the ring. He reached out with his other hand, his thumb gently brushing the tear away from Meyerla's skin with a tenderness that was more frightening than his rage. Never again, he vowed, his voice echoing in the sudden stillness of the room. You are coming home. The golden light of the bistro, once a source of warmth, now felt like a spotlight on a stage where Meyerla was the only one who didn't know her lines. She stood in the narrow corridor between the kitchen and the dining room, her hand pressed against the cool plaster wall to steady herself. The air was thick with the scent of red roses, the heavy, cloying perfume of 1,000 petals, and it made her stomach churn. Alessio always favored roses. In their past life, he would fill their bedroom with them after a long absence, the deep crimson of the blooms matching the intensity of his devotion. Now, that same scent was a warning bell, a herald of a man she had spent 8 months trying to excise from her heart. She heard him before she saw him. It was a low, resonant baritone that cut through the superficial chatter of the room like a blade through silk. He was laughing, a rare, quiet sound that used to be reserved only for her in the soft darkness of their home. To hear it now, directed at another woman, was a physical blow. It was the sound of her replacement, the sound of a world that had moved on while she was busy surviving. The Gold Coast property is finalized, Serafina, Alessio said. His voice carried that familiar, effortless authority. It's a legacy piece. It deserves a woman who understands its worth. Meyerla closed her eyes, her breath hitching. The way he spoke her name, Serafina, was clinical yet indulgent. It was the sound of a man building a new empire on the ashes of his old one. She could almost picture him, the way his dark eyes would be focused entirely on the woman in front of him, the way his large, ringed fingers would be toyed with his wine glass, and that single red rose pinned to his lapel like a fresh wound. I want the ballroom redone in white marble, a feminine voice replied, sharp and shimmering with triumph. Something timeless, Alessio, something that says the Viley name isn't just feared, it's untouchable. Meyerla flinched. That was the dream they had once shared. They were supposed to be the ones to bring the family into the light, to trade the blood-stained ledgers for legitimate legacy. Now, he was offering that dream to a woman who probably didn't know the weight of the suit he wore or the scars he carried beneath it. Every instinct Myrla possessed screamed at her to turn back, to drop the silver tray and run through the kitchen's rear exit into the cold, damp safety of the alley. But her feet were heavy, anchored by the reality of her life. She had 4 tables left on her shift. She had rent due in 3 days. And beneath her apron, the baby gave a sudden, sharp kick, a tiny reminder that she was no longer just running for herself. She took a jagged breath, forcing the air into her lungs. She had to be invisible. She had been Maddie, the quiet waitress, for months. She could do this for 10 more minutes. She smoothed her hair, tucked a loose strand behind her ear, and adjusted the black apron to better hide the curve of her stomach. As she stepped into the dining room, the world seemed to sharpen. She saw the platinum blonde hair of the woman at table 12 first, a waterfall of pale silk that caught the chandelier light. Serafina Vale was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, like a diamond sharpened into a weapon. She leaned toward Alessio, her fingers grazing the sharp line of his jaw with a possessive familiarity that made Myrla's blood run cold. And then there was Alessio. He sat with his back partially to the room, but even from the side his profile was devastating. The light caught the stubble on his jaw and the cold, calculating depth of his eyes. He looked older, harder, as if the 8 months since her death had carved away any remaining softness. He was the Don now, fully and completely, without a wife to pull him back from the edge of the abyss. Myrla moved toward them, her movements mechanical, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her chest. Each step felt like a betrayal of the peace she had fought so hard to find. The clinking of glasses and the smell of truffle oil blurred into a background hum as she neared the lion's den. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the condensation on the water carafe, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years that he wouldn't look up. She reached the table just as Alessio reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, red velvet box, snapping it open with a clinical click. Inside, a diamond the size of a postage stamp winked in the light. "A promise," Alessio said, his voice dropping to that intimate register that used to make Myrla feel like the only woman in the world. "To the future of the Virely name." Serafina gasped, her flawless face lighting up with a predatory joy. "It's perfect, Alessio, absolutely perfect." Myrla stood there, a ghost at her own husband's engagement. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, a cocktail of exhaustion, pregnancy, and raw, unadulterated heartbreak. She was so close she could smell his scent, cedarwood, expensive tobacco, and that underlying hint of iron. It was the scent of her home, her husband, and her destroyer. She reached out to set the water carafe down, her hand trembling so violently that the glass rattled against the wood. The sound was small, but in the quiet intensity of their moment, it was like a gunshot. Alessio's hand, which had been reaching for Serafina's, went still. He didn't look up immediately, but she saw his nostrils flare, as if he were catching a scent on the wind that didn't belong in a suburban bistro. The air between them tightened, a string pulled to the snapping point. Myrla froze, her breath trapped in her throat. She was a waitress. She was a fugitive. She was a mother. And for the first time in 8 months, she was terrified that being a ghost wouldn't be enough to save her. The heavy silver tray felt like a lead weight against Myrla's shoulder, a physical manifestation of the dread pooling in her stomach. She stood in the shadow of the kitchen's swinging doors, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. The scent of cedarwood and expensive tobacco, Alessio's scent, seemed to have permeated the very oxygen of the restaurant, suffocating her. "What are you waiting for? They've been sitting there for 5 minutes without water," the manager hissed, appearing at her elbow like a specter of her misfortune. He didn't notice the way her hand trembled or the sheer terror glazing her eyes. To him, she was just an employee who had become increasingly slow as her pregnancy progressed. "I can't," Myrla whispered, her voice cracking. "Please, Marcus, send Alina. Send anyone else." "Alina is tied up with a party of 12, and you're the only one left who hasn't botched a VIP order tonight," Marcus snapped, his eyes hard. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a threatening low. "That man out there is Alessio Virely. He doesn't just pay our bills, he owns the street this building sits on. If you don't get out there and give him perfect service, don't bother coming back for your shift tomorrow. Think about that baby, Myrla. You need this job." The mention of the baby was the final blow. Myrla looked down at the swell of her stomach, hidden beneath the thick black fabric of her apron. He was right. She had no savings, no family, and no identity left beyond this grueling work. She shifted the tray, feeling the cool condensation of the water carafe seep through her sleeve, and nodded once, a numb, mechanical movement. She pushed through the doors. The transition from the chaotic heat of the kitchen to the cool, dimly lit elegance of the dining room felt like stepping onto a gallows. Every step toward the center VIP booth was a countdown to the end of her life as Maddie. Alessio was leaning back, his tall, muscular frame dominating the space. He looked every bit the dark king of the Chicago underworld, his sharp jawline shadowed by light stubble, his dark hair perfectly slicked back. He was listening to Serafina, who was gesturing animatedly with a hand weighted down by the massive diamond he had just placed on her finger. The red rose pinned to his lapel looked like a fresh wound against his black tailored suit. Myrla kept her head bowed, her dark hair falling forward to shroud her face. She focused on the rhythm of her own heartbeat, which was drumming a frantic, irregular beat against her ribs. "Don't look up. Keep your voice steady. Serve the water and leave." She reached the edge of the mahogany table. The air here was different, colder, sharper, charged with the kinetic energy that always surrounded Alessio. "Good evening," she managed to say, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears, thin and strained. "Would you like to start with sparkling or still water?" "Still," Serafina answered without looking at her, her eyes fixed on the way the chandelier light caught her new ring. "And make sure it's chilled. My last glass was tepid." Myrla reached for the first glass, her fingers slick with sweat. She poured the water, the sound of the liquid hitting the crystal sounding like a waterfall in the sudden silence of her own mind. She moved to the second glass, Alessio's glass. As she leaned forward, the tray shifted. Her back, already screaming from the long hours on her feet, gave a sudden, sharp twinge of protest. She gasped, her balance faltering for a split second. She caught herself, but the movement caused her apron to pull tight across her middle, revealing the unmistakable, high curve of her 7-month pregnancy. Alessio, who had been looking at his fiancée with a mask of polite boredom, shifted his gaze. It started at her hands, reddened from dishwater and shaking, then moved up her arm to the waitress's name tag that read Maddie. Finally, his eyes landed on her stomach. Myrla felt his gaze like a physical heat. It was a weight, a pressure that demanded she acknowledge him. She tried to pull away, to finish the service and flee, but her body wouldn't obey. Slowly, as if pulled by an invisible thread, she lifted her head. The collision was instantaneous and violent. Alessio's dark eyes, usually so cold and calculating, widened with a shock so profound it looked like pain. The color drained from his face, leaving him ashen. For a moment, the great Don of the Virely family looked utterly vulnerable. His breath hitched in his throat, a ragged, audible sound that cut through Serafina's idle chatter. Myrla's heart stopped. She saw the moment of recognition, the way his mind raced to bridge the gap between the woman he had buried 8 months ago and the exhausted, pregnant waitress standing before him. Myrla. The name was a ghost's breath, spoken with such raw agony that it shattered the last of her composure. The silver tray slipped from her fingers. It hit the floor with a deafening, discordant crash. Glass shattered, water sprayed across the expensive carpet, and the silver cloches rolled away like discarded armor. The sound echoed through the silent restaurant. drawing every eye in the room to the center booth. Myrla didn't move. She couldn't. She was trapped in the gravity of his stare. She saw the rage beginning to simmer beneath the shock, the fury of a man who had been lied to, the possessiveness of a predator finding his lost mate, and the sudden, sharp focus on the child she was carrying. "Alessio, what is wrong with you?" Serafina demanded, her seductive smile replaced by a look of confusion and mounting irritation. "It's just a clumsy waitress. Look at my dress," she nearly. "Be quiet," Alessio commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He didn't look at his fiancée. He didn't look at the mess on the floor. He rose from his seat, his towering height casting a long, dark shadow over Myrla. He stepped over the broken glass, ignoring the manager who was rushing forward with apologies. He stopped inches from her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, the scent of him wrapping around her like a shroud. He reached out, his large hand trembling slightly as he hovered near her face, as if afraid she was a hallucination that would dissolve at his touch. His thumb finally brushed the line of her jaw, his touch searingly familiar. "You're alive," he whispered, his voice thick with 1,000 emotions she wasn't ready to face. His gaze dropped to her stomach again, his hand moving downward with a terrifying, slow purpose. "And you've been hiding my heir in the dark." Myrla's eyes filled with hot, stinging tears. The safety of her anonymity was gone. The nightmare had caught up to her, and as Alessio's hand finally came to rest against the swell of her belly, she knew there was no going back. The waitress was dead. The queen had been found. The sound of the tray hitting the floor was a tectonic shift, a violent end to the quiet life Myrla had built with blood, sweat, and silence. Shards of crystal skittered across the dark wood floor, coming to rest near the polished toes of Alessio's shoes, but he didn't flinch. His world had narrowed to the woman standing before him, the ghost he had mourned, the wife he had burned, and the mother of the child currently kicking against his palm. "Myrla," he said again, the name thick with a lethal mixture of agony and possessiveness. He didn't care that the entire restaurant had gone silent, or that the air was thick with the scent of spilled wine and shock. His hand remained anchored to her stomach, his fingers splayed as if he were trying to memorize the heartbeat of his heir through the fabric of her cheap waitress uniform. "Alessio, let go of her this instant." Serafina's voice rose to a shrill, piercing pitch. She stood up, her gold dress shimmering like the scales of a serpent. "You're touching a servant. You're making a spectacle of us. Manager, get this woman out of here before I sue this pathetic establishment into the ground." Marcus, the manager, scrambled forward, his face a mask of sweating panic. He saw the broken glass, he saw the VIP patron touching his employee, and he saw the ruin of his restaurant's reputation. He reached out to grab Myrla's arm, intending to yank her away and throw her into the alley where she belonged. "You clumsy, useless girl," Marcus hissed, his fingers digging into Myrla's shoulder. "I told you to be careful. You're fired. Get your things in." He never finished the sentence. With a speed that defied his massive frame, Alessio's other hand shot out, catching Marcus by the throat. The sound of indrawn breaths echoed through the bistro as Alessio hoisted the man nearly off his feet. The dark eyes were no longer filled with shock. They were filled with the cold, absolute promise of death. "If you touch her again," Alessio whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle the very foundations of the building, "I will burn this place to the ground with you locked inside. She is not your employee. She is my wife." The manager's face turned a bruised purple, his legs kicking uselessly as Alessio's grip tightened. Myrla reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched Alessio's forearm. "Alessio, stop, please, you'll kill him." At the sound of her voice, the animalistic rage in Alessio's eyes flickered. He threw Marcus aside like a piece of discarded trash, the manager hitting a nearby table with a sickening thud. Alessio didn't give him a second look. He turned his attention back to Serafina, who was standing paralyzed, her hand clutching the diamond on her finger as if it could protect her. "The engagement is over," Alessio stated, his tone as flat and final as a tombstone. Serafina's mouth dropped open. "Over? Alessio, you can't be serious. Our families, the alliance. You're throwing it all away for a waitress who ran away like a coward. She's a traitor. Everyone knows she sold the codes to the Vargos." Alessio stepped toward her, and for the first time, Serafina looked truly afraid. He reached out and gripped her hand, not with the tenderness he had shown Myrla, but with a clinical, terrifying strength. He unceremoniously stripped the emerald-cut diamond from her finger. "The Vargos are dead," Alessio said, his eyes narrowing. "And if I find out that your family had a hand in the evidence that forced my wife into hiding, you will be next. Get out. Now before I forget that I was raised to be a gentleman." Serafina didn't wait. She grabbed her designer clutch, her face twisted in a mask of humiliated rage, and fled the restaurant, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm against the floor. The silence that followed her departure was absolute. Alessio turned back to Myrla. The violence that had radiated from him seconds ago vanished, replaced by an intensity that made it hard for her to breathe. He looked at her disheveled bun, the dark circles under her eyes, and the way she was shaking. He looked at the white shirt that was strained across her belly, a belly that held the future he thought had been stolen from him. 8 months, he murmured, his voice cracking. 8 months I spent thinking you were at the bottom of the lake. I tore the city apart looking for you, Myrla. I killed men just for mentioning your name." "You would have killed me, Alessio," Myrla whispered, the tears finally overflowing. "The files, the betrayal. Everyone said you were coming for me. I had to protect him." She placed her hand over his, which was still resting against her stomach. "I had to protect our son." The word son seemed to hit Alessio like a physical blow. He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes as he let out a shuddering breath. The scent of her, the faint smell of kitchen grease mixed with the vanilla soap she had always used, filled his senses, grounding him. "I was a fool," he said into the space between them. "I let the vipers whisper in my ear, but that ends tonight." He reached down and scooped her into his arms, lifting her effortlessly. Myrla gasped, her arms instinctively wrapping around his neck, her head falling into the familiar crook of his shoulder. It felt like coming home, even as the terror of what came next loomed over her. "Alessio, where are we going?" "To a place where no one can touch you," he said, his voice regaining its ironclad certainty. He began to walk toward the exit, ignoring the broken glass and the staring patrons. He paused at the door, looking back at the cowering manager who was struggling to stand. "Send the bill for the damage to the Virely estate," Alessio commanded. "And consider this restaurant closed. I'm buying the lot. I don't want anyone else sitting where my wife had to serve." He stepped out into the cool night air, the neon lights of the city reflecting in the dark puddles on the pavement. His security team had already cleared a path, the black SUVs idling at the curb like waiting predators. As he settled Myrla into the back of the lead vehicle, he didn't let go of her hand. The bistro, the apron, and the life of Maddie were gone, left behind in the shattered glass on the floor. Myrla looked at Alessio, seeing the man she loved and the monster she feared, and she knew that the war was far from over. But as the car pulled away into the dark, she realized she was no longer fighting it alone. The interior of the black SUV was a vault of leather and silence, but for Myrla, the air felt dangerously thin. Alessio sat beside her, his presence a physical weight that pressed against her chest. He hadn't looked at her since he closed the heavy door, his gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window as the city lights blurred into long neon smears. His hand, however, had never let go of hers. His grip was firm, not painful but possessive, a silent declaration that the ghost he had found was never going back into the shadows. The vehicle came to a sudden, smooth halt at the edge of a secluded pier, far from the prying eyes of the downtown bistro. The rain had intensified. drumming a frantic rhythm against the roof. Without a word, Alessio stepped out into the deluge and circled the car, opening her door. He didn't offer his hand. He simply leaned in and lifted her out again, as if she were made of glass. He set her down under the partial cover of a rusted warehouse overhang, but the wind swept the spray across them. Myrla shivered, her thin waitress uniform clinging to her skin. The cold was a sharp contrast to the heat radiating from Alessio as he stepped into her personal space, his tall frame cutting off the world behind him. "Look at me," he commanded. It wasn't a shout, but the low, vibrato rumble made her knees weak. Myrla lifted her chin, her wet hair sticking to her cheeks. In the dim, flickering light of a distant street lamp, Alessio's face was a map of raw, unfiltered agony. The cold, calculating Don was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he was bleeding from an invisible wound. "They told me you were dead, Myrla," he whispered, his voice cracking against the sound of the rain. "I watched the footage of the car going over the bridge. I spent months hunting the men who supposedly put you there. I lived in a house that smelled like your perfume and felt like a tomb." "I had to go, Alessio," she cried, the words tumbling out in a rush of salt and rain. "The ledgers, the evidence they planted in my jewelry box. Everyone was saying you were the one who signed the order. I heard your cousin, Dante, telling the guards that you wanted me erased for the Vargo leak. I didn't think you'd listen to me. I thought I was already a dead woman to you." Alessio's eyes darkened with a terrifying clarity. "Dante," he repeated, the name sounding like a death sentence. He stepped closer, his hands coming up to frame her face. His thumbs brushed over her wet skin, his touch so tender it hurt. "I never signed an order. I was coming home that night to tell you we were leaving. I was going to step down. I was going to take you to the coast, far away from the ledgers and the blood." The realization hit her like a physical blow. They had been played against each other by the very people they trusted. But as the shock of the past settled, the reality of the present took hold. Alessio's gaze dropped, his focus shifting to the undeniable swell of her stomach. The anger in his eyes softened into something far more complex, a desperate, burgeoning hope. He reached out, his hand trembling as he let it rest against the center of her belly. Myrla held her breath. This was the moment she had feared most during those long, lonely nights in her studio apartment. "You're nearly 7 months," he murmured, his voice thick with a sudden, sharp calculation. "The night you vanished. We had been fighting for weeks because of the rumors. We hadn't been together since the gala in December." Myrla nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I found out 2 weeks after I left. I was hiding in a motel in Ohio, watching the news to see if you were looking for me or hunting me. When the test turned positive, I knew I could never come back. If Dante found out I was carrying your heir, he would have finished what he started. I couldn't let our son die because of a Mafia power struggle." Alessio's hand tightened slightly against her, and for the first time he felt it, a sharp, distinct kick from within. He froze, his eyes snapping up to meet hers. The sheer, primal wonder on his face was unlike anything she had ever seen. The ruthless boss of the Virely syndicate disappeared, replaced by a man discovering he had a future. "He's mine," Alessio breathed, a ragged laugh of disbelief escaping his throat. "He's alive, you're both alive." "I was so scared, Alessio," Myrla sobbed, the weight of 8 months of isolation finally breaking her. "I worked double shifts. I changed my name. I lived in a room with a lock that didn't work because I spent all my money on prenatal vitamins and small clothes I had to hide in a suitcase. I thought I was protecting him from you." Alessio pulled her into his chest, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, protective strength that seemed to shut out the cold and the rain. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot against her skin. "I will kill every man who made you live like that," he vowed into her skin. "I will tear the tongue out of anyone who spoke a lie against you. And Dante will pray for a death as quick as the one he tried to give you." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his expression turning solemn. The rain was washing away the stains of the bistro, the scent of grease, and the identity of Maddie. The timeline changes everything, Meyerla. It proves you never left because of a betrayal. You left because you were a mother protecting her child from a monster you thought was me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean silk handkerchief, gently wiping the rain from her eyes. We aren't going to the estate. It's compromised. We're going to the penthouse at the Heights. It's a fortress. No one enters without my thumbprint. What about Serafina? Her family won't let this go, Meyerla whispered, thinking of the blonde woman's vitriolic exit. Serafina was a business arrangement to keep the Veils from siding with Dante, Alessio said, his eyes turning back to ice. The arrangement ended the second I saw your face. If they want a war, I'll give them one, but they won't do it while you're standing in a restaurant kitchen. He picked her up again, mindful of her back, and carried her back to the SUV. As he settled her into the heated seat and wrapped a cashmere blanket around her shoulders, the shift in his demeanor was absolute. He was no longer just a man who had found his wife. He was a king who had discovered his legacy was intact. As the car sped away from the docks and toward the glimmering towers of the city's most secure district, Meyerla looked at Alessio. He was on his phone, his voice low and clipped as he issued orders that would likely reshape the city's underworld by morning. But even as he commanded his empire, his other hand remained firmly linked with hers, his thumb tracing the spot where her wedding ring used to be. The escape into the night wasn't just about leaving the bistro behind. It was the start of a reclamation. Meyerla closed her eyes, the warmth of the car and the strength of Alessio's grip finally allowing her to drift toward a sleep that wasn't haunted by fear. She was no longer the nameless waitress in the rain. She was back in the center of the storm, but this time, the lion was standing guard. The transition from the cold, rain-slicked docks to the fortified sanctuary of the Heights was a blur of high-speed motion and whispered commands. As the elevator ascended silently toward the penthouse, Meyerla watched Alessio's reflection in the brushed steel panels. He was already transforming back into the Don, his jaw set in a hard line, his hands moving rhythmically over his phone as he coordinated a global lockdown of his interests. Yet every few seconds, his eyes would flick to her, checking her pulse, her breathing, and the way she held her stomach, as if he expected her to vanish again if he looked away for too long. When the doors opened, the penthouse greeted them with the smell of old wood and expensive air. It was a fortress of glass and stone, a place designed to keep the world at bay. Alessio led her into the expansive living area, but he didn't stop to let her admire the view of the city's glittering skyline. He steered her straight toward a plush velvet sofa, wrapping a fresh, dry blanket around her shoulders. "Stay here," he murmured, his voice softening only for her. "I have to secure the perimeter. I'll be back in 5 minutes." Meyerla watched him disappear into the study, the heavy oak doors closing with a definitive click. She was alone with her thoughts for the first time since the tray had shattered at his feet. The silence of the apartment was heavy, a stark contrast to the clatter of the bistro. She ran a hand over the velvet of the sofa, feeling the luxury she had once taken for granted. The door to the study remained closed longer than promised. 10 minutes stretched into 20. Meyerla felt the old familiar anxiety crawling up her throat. In this world, silence was rarely a good sign. She stood up, her back protesting the movement, and walked toward the hallway leading to the guest suites. She needed to wash the scent of the restaurant from her skin, but as she passed a set of double doors near the end of the hall, she heard a sound that stopped her in her tracks. It was the sound of a labored, rattling breath, followed by a soft, rhythmic clicking, the sound of a rosary hitting a wooden bedside table. Meyerla hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. She knew this part of the penthouse was usually reserved for Alessio's mother, Lucia. Lucia had been the only person who had treated Meyerla like a daughter, rather than a political acquisition during her first months in the Weierle family. But the rumors Meyerla had heard during her months in hiding suggested that Lucia had retreated to the family estate in Sicily. Slowly, Myrla pushed the door open. The room was bathed in the soft, clinical glow of a medical monitor, its steady beep-beep-beep the only heartbeat in the room. In the center of the massive four-poster bed sat Lucia Vyerly. She looked like a shadow of the woman Myrla remembered. Her skin was the color of parchment, and her once vibrant eyes were sunken, though they still burned with a fierce, dying light. Myrla, the older woman whispered, her voice a dry rasp. She didn't look surprised. She looked relieved, as if she had been waiting for a ghost to finally walk through the door. Lucia, Myrla gasped, rushing to the bedside. She took the woman's frail hand in hers, shocked by how thin the bones felt. What happened? Why are you here like this? Lucia managed a weak, bittersweet smile. The body decides when the war is over, Kara. My war is coming to an end. A diagnosis of the blood. The doctors give it long names, but it simply means I am leaving. Myrla felt a lump form in her throat. Lucia had been the silent heart of the syndicate, the only one who could truly check Alessio's darker impulses. To see her reduced to this was a testament to how much the family had crumbled in Myrla's absence. Does Alessio know? Myrla asked. He knows I am sick, but he does not know how close the clock is to midnight, Lucia replied. She squeezed Myrla's hand with surprising strength, her gaze shifting to the prominent curve of Myrla's belly. A tear escaped the corner of her eye. A child, a Vyerly heir. Heaven has a strange way of balancing the scales. Before Myrla could respond, the door swung open. Alessio stood in the frame, his face darkening when he saw Myrla at his mother's bedside. He strode into the room, his eyes darting between the two women. Myrla, you should be resting, he said, his tone clipped, though his hand instinctively went to his mother's shoulder. Alessio, sit, Lucia commanded. It was the old voice, the one that had ruled dinner tables for decades. Alessio hesitated, then sat on the edge of the bed. The room felt smaller with him in it, the tension between his grief for his mother and his possessiveness of his wife creating a heavy, electric atmosphere. I have spent my life watching men break things, Lucia said, looking directly at her son. I watched your father break his enemies, and I watched you break your own heart when you let the vipers tell you Myrla was a traitor. I will not die watching you break the future of this family. Mama, don't speak of dying, Alessio muttered, his jaw tightening. I will speak of it because it is the only truth I have left, she snapped. She reached out, taking Alessio's hand and placing it over Myrla's, joining them over the child. This is the Queen's request, Alessio, not a suggestion, a command. She looked at her son with an intensity that seemed to drain the last of her energy. The Veils are coming. Dante is coming. They will try to use the child as a pawn. They will try to convince you that Myrla is a liability. You must swear the last vow to me, right now, in the presence of your wife and your unborn son. Myrla felt Alessio's pulse quickening beneath her palm. The last vow was a sacred, ancient oath in their world. It was a promise made to a dying matriarch that could never be broken, even if it meant the destruction of the entire syndicate. Swear it, Lucia insisted, her breathing becoming more shallow. Swear that from this moment until your last breath, Myrla's safety is the only law. Swear that the syndicate comes second to her life. Swear that if the choice is between the Empire and the mother of your child, you will burn the Empire to the ground to keep her warm. The silence in the room was absolute. Myrla looked at Alessio, seeing the struggle in his eyes. He was a man built on tradition and power, a man who had been raised to put the outfit above all else. To swear this vow was to dismantle everything he had been trained to be. Alessio looked down at their joined hands. He felt the kick of his son beneath Myrla's skin, a tiny, defiant heartbeat that was more powerful than any army he commanded. He looked at his mother's fatting light, and then at Myrla's tear-stained, beautiful face. I swear it, Mama, Alessio said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute, terrifying conviction. On my soul and the blood of my son, Myrla is the law, The empire is hers to rule or hers to burn. I swear the last vow." Lucia let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief, her eyes drifting shut as the monitor's beep seemed to steady. She had done her work. She had anchored the Don to the only thing that could save his humanity. Alessio stood up, pulling Myrla into the circle of his arms. He didn't look back at the bed. He looked toward the glass walls of the penthouse, out at the city that was currently arming itself against them. He had made his choice. The waitress was gone, and the queen was protected by an oath that would either save the Virely name or end it forever. The air inside the penthouse felt brittle, a fragile glass sphere holding back a gathering storm. Alessio had been packing the length of the floor-to-ceiling windows for an hour, his silhouette a dark, jagged shadow against the flickering lights of the city below. Myrla sat on the edge of the velvet armchair, her hands interlaced over the peak of her stomach. The baby was restless, moving with a frantic energy that mirrored the tension vibrating through the room. The quiet was unnatural, the kind of silence that preceded a landslide. "They're moving," Alessio said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. He didn't turn around. He was looking at the reflection of the hallway in the glass, his hand resting on the grip of the sidearm holstered beneath his tailored jacket. "The Veils have pulled their security from the perimeter of the heights. They're clearing a path." "Dante wouldn't move this soon," Myrla whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to be brave. "He's a snake, Alessio. He waits for the tall grass. He wouldn't risk an open assault on your primary residence." "He isn't waiting anymore," Alessio countered, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were cold, filled with the dark light of a man who had already accepted the cost of the coming war. "I broke the alliance with Serafina in front of 50 witnesses. I humiliated the Veils. Dante knows that if he doesn't strike tonight, I'll have his head on a spike by dawn. He has no choice but to be bold." The intercom on the wall buzzed, a sharp, invasive sound that made Myrla jump. Alessio crossed the room in 2 strides, clicking the receiver. "Don Virely, we have 3 blacked-out vans entering the subterranean garage," a voice crackled through the speaker, tight with urgency. "They're not using family codes. They've bypassed the primary gate." "Engage the lockdown," Alessio commanded, his tone shifting into the rhythmic precision of a battlefield general. "Ventilation on internal loop. If they reach the elevators, cut the power. I want them trapped in the shafts." "Understood, sir. But there's something else. Dante is on the comms. He says he wants to speak to the waitress." Alessio's jaw tightened so hard the bone seemed ready to snap. He looked at Myrla, his gaze softening for a heartbeat before hardening into ice. He didn't answer the comms. Instead, he walked over to the heavy oak cabinet near the fireplace and pulled out a tactical submachine gun, checking the chamber with a metallic clack that echoed through the room like a death knell. "Myrla, go to the panic room behind the library," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Now, don't wait for the elevators, just move." She stood up, her back aching, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took 2 steps toward the hallway when the world suddenly dissolved into white light and a deafening, bone-shaking roar. The explosion didn't come from the door or the garage. It came from the sky. A breach charge, planted by a drone or a high-altitude team, detonated against the reinforced glass of the north-facing wall. The sound was an atmospheric vacuum, followed by a violent outward pressure that sent a hail of glass shards shrieking through the air. Myrla was thrown to the floor, the thick carpet the only thing saving her from the jagged fragments. The wind howled into the penthouse, carrying the scent of cordite and the cold, damp air of the high-altitude night. Through the smoke and the swirling snow of pulverized drywall, Myrla saw the dark shapes of men in tactical gear swinging in on repelling lines. Their silhouettes framed by the jagged hole where the wall used to be. "Myrla," Alessio's voice was a roar through the chaos. He was already firing, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of his weapon cutting through the wind. He moved with a predatory grace, using a marble pillar for cover as he suppressed the first wave of invaders. Smoke grenades hissed across the floor, filling the room with a thick, choking gray veil. Myrla struggled to her feet, her hand clutched over her stomach, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She could hear the heavy thud of boots hitting the floor and the distorted voices of men shouting orders through tactical radios. Through the haze, she saw a figure standing by the broken glass, a man who wasn't wearing a mask. It was Dante. He looked different in the chaos, unhinged, his usual calculated veneer replaced by a desperate, hungry madness. He held a gold-plated pistol, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Myrla. "The ghost returns," Dante shouted over the wind. "You should have stayed dead, Myrla. You've cost us everything. The Veils want blood, and I'm the one who's going to give it to them." He leveled his weapon at her, but before he could pull the trigger, Alessio lunged from behind the pillar. He didn't fire. He tackled Dante with the force of a freight train, the two men crashing into a glass-topped table that shattered under their weight. "Get to the room," Alessio screamed at her, his hands locked around Dante's throat as the two men rolled across the floor. "Myrla, move." She turned and ran, her body heavy and clumsy, her instincts focused entirely on the life kicking frantically inside her. She reached the library, the sound of gunfire and shattering stone following her like a vengeful spirit. She slammed the door behind her, fumbling for the hidden catch behind the leather-bound books. As the bookshelf swung open to reveal the steel-lined sanctuary of the panic room, another explosion rocked the building, this one from the hallway. The lights flickered and died, leaving the penthouse bathed in the red, pulsing glow of the emergency strobes. Myrla stepped into the panic room, her hand on the heavy steel lever to lock it from the inside, but she stopped. She looked back through the library door, seeing the smoke curling through the air and hearing the sound of the man she loved fighting for their future in the ruins of their home. She felt a sudden, sharp contraction, a searing bolt of pain that forced her to her knees. Her breath caught in her throat as a warm wetness soaked through her clothes. "No," she whispered, her voice lost in the roar of the wind and the fire. "Not now, please, not now." The powder keg had blown, and as the first drops of blood hit the floor, Myrla realized that the siege wasn't just happening outside the walls. Her son was coming, and he was arriving in the middle of a massacre. The steel door of the panic room slid shut with a heavy, pressurized hiss, sealing Myrla into a world of sterile white light and muffled thunder. Outside, the penthouse was a war zone, the rhythmic thud of suppressed gunfire and the shattering of marble creating a terrifying percussion. But inside, the only sound was Myrla's own ragged breathing. She collapsed against the cold metal wall, her hands clutching the swell of her stomach as another contraction ripped through her, a white-hot blade of pain that stole the air from her lungs. "Not yet," she gasped, her forehead pressed against the reinforced steel. "Please, not yet." But her body was no longer listening to her fear. The stress of the explosion and the sight of Dante's madness had triggered something primal and unstoppable. She was alone in a fortress of high-tech security, but she had never felt more vulnerable. She slid down to the floor, her waitress uniform damp with sweat and the unmistakable reality of her water breaking. On the other side of the door, the sounds of the siege intensified. She heard the heavy boots of the Veil strike team, the shouted commands of men who had come to erase her existence. And then, she heard the voice that anchored her to the earth. "Stay away from that door." Alessio's roar was a force of nature, followed by the deafening, rapid-fire bark of his weapon. He was standing guard. Myrla could picture him, the red rose on his lapel likely torn or bloodied, his black suit covered in the dust of the ruined ceiling, his dark eyes burning with the lethal promise of the last vow. He wasn't just fighting for his territory or his pride anymore. He was a sentinel at the gates of his legacy. A massive thud shook the door, a battering ram or a breach charge. Myrla screamed as a fresh wave of agony doubled her over. She curled onto her side on the plush rug, her fingers digging into the fibers. "Alessio," she cried out, though she knew the soundproof walls would swallow her voice. As if he could sense her pain through the steel, the intercom on the wall crackled to life. It was a one-way channel he must have activated from his mobile unit. "Myrla, breathe." His voice came through, strained and breathless, punctuated by the metallic clink of a fresh magazine sliding into his rifle. "I'm here. I'm right outside. They aren't getting through. Do you hear me? No one touches you." "Alessio, the baby," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "He's coming. I can't stop it." There was a momentary pause in the gunfire outside, a chilling silence that lasted only seconds. "Listen to me, Myrla." Alessio's voice was lower now, intimate and raw, cutting through the red haze of her pain. "You are the strongest woman I have ever known. You survived 8 months in the dark alone. You can do this. Focus on my voice. I'm not leaving this doorway. I am the wall between you and the world, and I will not break." Another explosion rocked the hallway, followed by a chorus of shouting. Myrla heard the heavy, wet thud of bodies hitting the floor and the splintering of wood. Alessio was holding the narrow corridor against an entire tactical team, a lone king defending a crumbling castle. "I swear to you, Myrla," Alessio's voice returned, grittier now, as if he were speaking through gritted teeth. "The first thing our son will see is a world where his mother is safe. I'm staying right here. I'm with you." Myrla closed her eyes, clutching the edge of a heavy equipment table. She visualized him standing there, a silhouette of defiance in the smoke-filled hallway. The pain came again, a tidal wave that demanded everything she had left. She pushed, a primal cry tearing from her throat, her entire world narrowing down to the rhythm of her breath and the sound of Alessio's voice over the speakers. Outside, the battle was reaching a fever pitch. Dante's voice rose above the din, screaming for the team to move forward, for the door to be blown. Alessio's response was a cold, rhythmic fire that didn't falter. He was a machine of war, fueled by the sacred oath he had given his mother and the love he had rediscovered in a rain-slicked alley. "I've got you," Alessio whispered into the comms, his voice a steadying thread in the chaos. "Push, Myrla. Bring him into the world. I'm holding the line." With a final, agonizing surge of effort, the world seemed to burst into 1,000 points of light. The crushing pressure vanished, replaced by a sudden, shocking lightness. And then, a sound rose above the muffled gunfire and the howling wind, a thin, sharp, indignant cry. Myrla fell back against the floor, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face as she reached down to gather the small, slippery weight of her son. He was warm, screaming with the full force of his lungs, a tiny miracle born in the heart of a massacre. At that exact moment, a final, massive explosion echoed through the penthouse, the sound of the secondary support pillars collapsing as Alessio's team finally arrived to flank the invaders. The gunfire outside began to fade, replaced by the heavy, authoritative shouts of Alessio's loyalist soldiers. The intercom crackled one last time. "Myrla," Alessio's voice was thick with emotion, sounding more tired than she had ever heard it. "I heard him. I heard my son." "He's here, Alessio," she whispered, pulling the baby to her chest and wrapping him in the soft cashmere blanket she had found on the shelf. "He's perfect." "The hallway is clear," Alessio said, and she could hear the sound of him leaning his weight against the door. "I'm coming in. The vipers are gone." The steel door hissed open. Alessio stood there, a vision of ruin and resurrection. His suit was shredded, his face streaked with soot and blood, and his shoulder was soaked red where a graze had opened the skin. But when his eyes landed on Myrla sitting on the floor with their son in her arms, the warrior vanished. He dropped his weapon, the heavy metal clattering uselessly on the floor, and sank to his knees beside her. He didn't say a word as he reached out, his large, shaking hand hovering over the baby's small, tufted head. "He has your eyes," Alessio whispered, a single tear cutting a track through the dust on his cheek. He pulled them both into his arms, his blood-stained jacket shielding them from the cooling air of the ruined penthouse. Outside, the city was still bright, unaware of the war that had just ended. But inside the panic room, a new reign had begun, one built not on alliances or ledgers, but on a vow kept in the dark and a love that had survived the fire. The grand ballroom of the Vierly d'Acosta Foundation was a sea of shimmering glass and ivory silk, a testament to a world that had been scrubbed clean of the scent of gunpowder. 5 years had passed since the night the heights had burned, and the city that once whispered Alessio's name in fear now spoke it with the hushed reverence reserved for its most powerful philanthropists. The transition to legitimacy had been a slow, methodical reconstruction, but as Meyerla stood on the mezzanine overlooking the gala, she knew the transformation was complete. She was no longer the woman in the stained apron, hiding her breath in the steam of a kitchen. Tonight, she wore a gown of deep emerald velvet that clung to her regal silhouette, her neck adorned with a collar of emeralds that had once belonged to Lucia. Her dark hair was swept up in an intricate crown, revealing the calm, steady gaze of a woman who had walked through fire and emerged as steel. "The board is asking for the final signature on the hospital wing, Meyerla," a voice murmured beside her. She turned to see Alessio. He looked every bit the legitimate titan of industry in his midnight blue tuxedo, though the way he stood, shoulders back, eyes constantly scanning the room, betrayed the predator that still lived beneath the refined exterior. The silver at his temples only added to his gravity, a physical marker of the years they had spent dismantling the old world to build a sanctuary for the new one. "It's already done," Meyerla replied, her voice smooth and certain. She reached out, her fingers grazing the line of his jaw. "The wing will be named after your mother. It's what she wanted, a place of healing to balance the ledgers." Alessio's hand covered hers, his thumb tracing the heavy gold wedding band that had been restored to her finger 5 years ago. He pulled her hand to his lips, his gaze softening in a way he only allowed when they were alone, or when the rest of the world felt sufficiently far away. "You've done more for this name than I ever did," he whispered. "You took a ghost and turned it into a queen." Their moment was interrupted by a small, energetic blur of motion that darted between the silk-covered tables. A young boy, barely 5 years old, skidded to a halt in front of them. He was a miniature mirror of his father, with dark, messy curls and a pair of intense, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He was dressed in a tiny tailored suit, though his bow tie was already crooked from his adventures. "Papa, Nana's garden has the big fountains on," the boy exclaimed, his face lit with a pure, infectious joy. "Can we go see? You promised." Alessio laughed, a warm, open sound that would have shocked the men who had known him half a decade ago. He reached down and hoisted his son into his arms, the boy settling naturally against his shoulder. "In a moment, Leo," Alessio said, ruffling the boy's hair. "First, you have to tell your mother how beautiful she looks. That is the first rule of being a gentleman." Leo looked at Meyerla, his eyes widening with the honest adoration of a child. "Mama looks like a star," he decided, leaning over to plant a sticky, sweet kiss on her cheek. Meyerla felt a swell of emotion so powerful it nearly stole her breath. This was the heir they had fought for in the panic room. This was the child who had survived a massacre to inherit a world of light. She reached out and straightened his tie, her touch lingering on the warmth of his skin. "Thank you, my little star," she whispered. As Alessio set the boy down and watched him race toward the buffet under the watchful eye of a security team that looked more like nannies than soldiers, the couple looked back out over the gala. The veils were a memory, their influence eroded by legal battles and the sheer, overwhelming success of the Vierly d'Acosta group. Dante was a name never spoken, a shadow that had been permanently erased by the very man he had tried to betray. The music shifted into a slow, melodic waltz, the violins soaring toward the high, gilded ceiling. Alessio offered Meyerla his hand, a silent invitation she had accepted 1,000 times before. He led her onto the floor, the crowd parting instinctively as they moved. As they danced, the world outside the ballroom faded. Myrla leaned her head against Alessio's shoulder, the familiar scent of cedarwood now mixed with the clean fragrance of expensive soap. She thought back to the night at the bistro, the sound of the tray shattering, the cold rain on the docks, and the terrifying weight of a secret she thought would kill her. "What are you thinking about?" Alessio asked, his voice a low vibration against her temple. "The waitress," Myrla admitted, pulling back just enough to look into his eyes. The one who was so terrified of the dark that she thought running was the only way to survive. Alessio stopped moving, his arms tightening around her waist as he pulled her flush against his chest. He looked at her with a fierce, unshakable pride that made her feel untouchable. "That waitress is gone, Myrla. She didn't just survive the dark, she conquered it. You're the one who controls the shadows now." Myrla looked out over the glittering room, seeing the way the most powerful men in the country watched them. They feared her husband, yes, but they respected her. She had been the casualty of their wars, and she had returned to be the architect of their peace. She had protected her child, reclaimed her husband, and built a legacy out of the ruins of a crime family. "Yes," Myrla whispered, a small, triumphant smile touching her lips as she leaned back into his embrace. "I suppose I do." The music swelled, the lights of the ballroom reflecting in her emeralds like 1,000 tiny stars. The saga of the Waitress, a story that had begun in blood and betrayal, had found its resolution in the quiet strength of a woman who refused to stay hidden. As they turned in the dance, perfectly synchronized and entirely unified, the ghost was truly gone. In her place stood a queen, and beside her, a king who would burn the world again just to keep her in the light. Thank you for watching. I hope you have subscribed to this channel.